That you just saw is a teaser for the Servant Leadership series that will be launching on the 21st of March at 10 a.m. If you're interested in viewing those interviews, you can go onto danielplaikes.com, and that series will be running for a duration of weeks in which you can see the conversations that the late Professor Daniel Plaikes had with various leaders. So for today, we will be having basically a snapshot into what this book is about and hoping to garner a lot of interest in actually reading the contents of this book. The discussion tonight is going to take place in 3 parts. Firstly, we will be talking about the person who spearheaded this project, the late Professor Daniel Plaikes, his passions and what sort of drove the interest and intent to actually complete this book. Thereafter, we'll be having a discussion about the topics that are covered in this book with our wonderful panelists who will be introduced shortly. And then we will also be allowing our attendees to answer a few questions, to have a few questions answered that they may have that are sparked throughout the conversation. I'll be queuing when you can start presenting questions within the chat. So for now, I'd just like to begin by introducing our panelists. Firstly, my name is Daniel Plaikes, and I am the second daughter of the late Professor Daniel Plaikes, who is the editor of this book. We can now begin by our next panelist, Chen, who will be introducing himself.
Okay, good evening, everybody, friends, colleagues, and dare I say, comrades. My friend is Chen Sen. I'm the head of research at the Financial and Fiscal Commission. My previous position at the Commission as a research specialist advisor to my chairperson was where I had the honor and privilege of serving Professor Daniel Plaikes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ike? Hi, Ike, we think that you might be on mute. If you could just turn your mic on.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isaac Morrow. I'm a former band and Benis journalist. I went to exile and came back when the organizations were unbanned. At the moment, I'm just an activist, especially against corruption and for the deepening of our democracy. Thank you.
Say, Neil, can you please introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Danielle. My name is Neil Cole. I suppose I can describe myself as a public finance specialist. I started my career in public finance more than 20 years ago at the National Treasury, and that's also where I met your dad. Started off as the Director of Budget Reform, and then spent some time as the Chief Director of Expenditure Planning, and then moved more into working in the continent as the Chief Director, African Economic Integration. I now head an intergovernmental organization that works with finance and budget ministries across Africa, mainly working on issues around public debt management, budget transparency and accountability, and also looking into important capabilities that are needed by finance ministries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. Stephen?
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Stephen Porter. I'm an evaluation specialist. I've worked on monitoring and evaluation systems across Africa, and I consider myself a sort of extended member of the Plaikes family. Daniel having been still is in a way, the godfather to my children, and I'm also a former lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. So I'm going to be talking today in my personal capacity, and to me, Daniel is a leader because he's still very present in my mind and lives on there, a manager, a mentor, and a friend to me.
Thank you to all our panelists, for introducing themselves. I'm very excited to get into the conversation today. But before we head into that conversation, I really just want to talk a bit more about the book. So as you can see now, I have the copy of Making Institutions Work here with me. And the book really is a back to basics type of book. It covers a broad spectrum of different institutions that exist in South Africa. It looks at how they exist, how they function. It's the shortcomings that also come with bad leadership and poorly directed institutions. And it really is quite broad. It covers a range of institutions that sort of make up our constitutional democracy. And we're very, very excited to firstly engage in these topics and also to possibly encourage some enthusiasm in what can be done to work towards creating a better and stronger constitutional democracy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to speak about the late Professor Daniel Plaatjes, about the passions that drove this book specifically and what sort of context and sort of frame this book was actually spearheaded within. So to begin that conversation, we're going to begin with Neil, who's going to lead us in that discussion.
Thanks, Daniel. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I met your dad at the National Treasury. We interacted, me from budget office and Daniel working in public finance. And I was obviously somebody from the budget office. My concern was aggregate fiscal discipline. I suppose being in public finance and in a sense representing the social sector in public finance with people like Julia De Bruin, who I also see as one of our attendees. Daniel and Julia were always sort of reminding us that, yes, I mean, fiscal aggregate discipline matters, but so does people. And that the challenges of poverty are very real. And in order to ensure that we do keep in place and strengthen social safety nets, the decisions we take in the Treasury are obviously very important. But it was also about, your dad and I finding ourselves in Pretoria, working at the Treasury, two boykies in a sense from the Cape Flats, working for an institution that at the time was considered to be one of the best performing. And it was due to largely the leadership of people like Trevor Manuel, having a strong team around him, a diversity that included some of the best economists in the country. And in that mix were several of us. I mean, Daniel, myself, Julia, and others, who in many ways, I suppose, were not expected, right? Considering our upbringing and the hardship of that upbringing, we were really not expected to make it into an institution as prestigious as the Treasury at the time. We were from Bontas and from the Chachis. And for those that don't know, I mean, that refers to Bonteheuwel, where Daniel grew up, and the Chachis, which is Manenberg, where I grew up. But let me just quickly touch on, the thing that has always struck me when I reflect, when I think about Daniel, in as many conversations that we had, and then also following his passing. Growing up in Bonteheuwel, your dad clearly had first-hand account of inequality, poverty, ravages of gangsterism and drugs. So that sense of what needed to be done was certainly a sense of a first-hand experience, right? His choice of his undergrad, I think, was about his commitment to wanting to tackle precisely those ravages of poverty and inequality, and to do it hands-on, right? The Treasury job, I think, was about, and this all speaks to his passion and clarity of thought. That Treasury job was about recognizing that the budget is a government's most important policy document, and in that it allocates money to the things that are going to get done. And if you want to sort of be at the center of a government's program, you have to get at the center of how its spending plan gets developed. The academia speaks for itself. I'm sure Stephen and others will speak to that. And I'm sure Chen will also speak about, I mean, just why did Daniel go to the FFC in that very senior position? I mean, for me, I think it was about recognizing that if you're interested in ensuring service delivery, local government is the most important terrain of service delivery, right? I mean, if you are passionate about people. Thanks, Daniel. Hope I did not go on for too long.
Thank you so much, Neil. I want to hand over to Chen now.
Thanks. Yeah, so I couldn't agree more in terms of that. I think the Professor Plakis has always been about the public value and the interests of the people, and the citizens of South Africa, the brothers and sisters of the country, of this land. So, and he put that as, I think, as his principle. And later on, maybe we'll discuss a little bit more about like a principle, a type of leadership that I think is imperative for all good leaders to have, which is a principle type of leadership. And earlier we also heard in the video that he said there's a slippages of ethical leadership in the country at the moment. So I think I think that's approach was also his way of establishing good leadership and good governance. Because to govern, one has to not just operate from the position of powers and authorities, okay, which you may have as honors and degrees and so forth, but also with legitimacy. And then that principle is what shall bring legitimacy. Yeah, I shall reflect some more later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen. I want to hand over to Ike now, please. Ike, you're on mute once again. If you could just unmute your mic. Thank you so much.
I was saying I've known Professor Plakis for almost a decade. We first met in a lift at the Wits University. And immediately after our brief discussions, I then invited him recruited him to come and work in the Free State. He did not hesitate, to accept a position, in this rural province of ours. His mandate was very clear, was that he should come here, infuse an intellectual, principle, within the administration, and ensure that he develops, ethical leadership in the province. We would have, very lengthy discussions with him every time we meet. Even when he had left the province, would have very long calls, whether it's in the morning, during the night, or during the day. He was indeed, the ever activist academic. He was always a professor who did not only teach, but, aspired to bring the best, of critical thinking out of his students or those he interacted with. In most cases, what we discussed with him, what I found very important, was the issue of leadership, were issues of the institutions of democracy. How viable, how enduring were they? Would they withstand, a rigorous, assaults? At this point in time, when we have, when we're caught in a grip of unethical leadership, a numbing paralysis, of leadership. He is not here, but we are at least, we at least have this opportunity to have a book that he has edited. To me, it's a sequel to the two other books, that he wrote, which also have to do, with good governance, with accountability. Coming to the institutions of our democracy, which are so very important because those are the pillars upon which our democracy, is resting on. I have found, a few gems which I feel strongly, that I should speak about or read them out, in that book. If I may, I promise it won't be long. This is the type of thinking, that we used to share, in our discussions with him. I quote, institutionalization is a process towards embeddedness of the rules, especially the rule of law that ensures the functional and structural integrity in the behavior of organizations and individuals. Institutions are major sources of shared patterns of organizational action, shaping transactional relationships between social actors and state action, leading to political, economic, and social stability within the allocation and distribution of power and control by managing and resolving competition, diversity, and conflict. Now, this is, Professor Plachi speaking. These are the type of discussions, one would have with him now and again. When we spoke of, visionary leadership, ethical leadership, when we spoke of, developing our country, and that the leadership that we ought to have is that leadership, that would always think of the people over and above, anything else. Perhaps to wind up, this little talk that I'm giving, I'll quote him again, in the same book when he says, I quote, while the institutions of our democracy must serve the interests of the people, especially the elite, must protect the integrity of the institutions. And I add, my own last line there, the institutions of our hard-won democracy. This is the Professor Plachi that I knew, that I interacted, at length with, a brother, a comrade, and a teacher. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to now invite Stephen just to end of this section of the conversation and just to talk about it, and then we will then travel into our panel discussion.
Sure, and maybe this is a bit of a segue into that discussion. To pick up what I've seen there, I was asking myself why Daniel found it important enough to write a book focusing on how institutions work, and specifically in South Africa. And as I said, this book really needs to be seen against the evolution of the books that Daniel worked on and edited over the past 10 years. We go back to 2011, the first book coming out, The Future Inheritance, was about building state capacity in a democratic South Africa. In 2013, the book Protecting the Inheritance discusses governance, public accountability in democratic South Africa. And now we see this book coming out, 2021. Been very busy over that period, and it's about making institutions work. And for me, I think in reading through this book, it's sort of the culmination of these three books. It's bringing them together, and that we start to see the thinking that's evolved over that time. We see a South Africa perspective brought forward, passionately argued around what's happening in South African institutions and the lessons and the failings and successes that we can see in how they've developed from a wide range of thinkers. We also see it bringing in international perspectives, providing different views on how institutions develop and how institutional formations can come about. And some of those, especially given his position, the independent oversight organizations, those that sort of sit within, but also outside of the main state formation, helping to be able to create that oversight of those institutions. And for me, across these three books, there's sort of three themes that really come out. There's that honesty of institutions, and we saw that in the starting video. The importance of honesty. For me, honesties are a critical facet of any part of leadership. And honesty doesn't necessarily mean truth, because often we all have our own honest perspectives. The way we get to truth is to be able to share our honest perspectives and try to find out where those converge, where we understand what is happening, in order for us to make that journey towards truth. And institutions are a major part of that. You need institutions to be honest with people and to tell people, we're doing well here, or we're not doing so well. The second theme that comes out of these 3 books is the responsiveness of the state. Who does the state work for and who does the state act for? And consistently across the 3 books and in this book, it's the responsiveness of the people, to the citizens of a country, to be able to respond and put in place changes that they desire, that speak to them. And especially to those who are disadvantaged or don't have access to the same political levers that those in power do. That comes across in all 3, that concern with how to bring that about. And I think a third part, which is important in these 3 books, in this book especially, is that notion of agency, and that leaders have agency. We're not just caught in systems, buffeted to and fro. We actually have the ability to define a course and set out to change the way something works, and to do that in an ethical and moral manner. And I think that sort of goes against some of the grain of the time, where we find more maybe postmodern sort of feelings that we're just here and we can't do much about it. We sort of just need to always go with the flow. But I think that sort of idea that we, as agents, as leaders, should take active role in institutions and change them is very important to me. And something that I take away and sort of think about, how do I reinvigorate my own practice and my own work in evaluation to take that onwards. So I think in talking to him, and it really having a braai, having a care with him in his garden over these last 15 years that I've known him, it's thinking about these not just in the South African context, but also in the global context. But I think there's the lessons that we can also pull out from these. We live at a time where people trust institutions less. Lying is become, in the country I live in now, which is the United States, an accepted way, a seemingly accepted way to transmit. But I think the thing is, we see that when you're not honest, things have holes in them and they sink. And I think it's that sinking that we've all got to not just plug those holes, not just bail out the water, but rebuild those vessels as we live and work on them. So that's what I see coming out of those 3 books, and that's why I think Daniel thought these books were important to write.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So now we're going to head into the section of this book launch where we will be having a panel discussion. And before we begin engaging in these questions that will cover a lot of the topics that come up in the book, we would like to invite the attendees to post any questions that they may have as the discussion progresses in the chat. Please write out your name, your occupation, or whatever organization you represent, and your question in the chat. And towards the end of the book launch, we will select a few of the questions to answer and discuss. And yeah, so let's get right into the panel discussion. The first question that I want to ask is to Ike Morrow, and it's going to ask, what do you think is significant about the current time we find ourselves in South Africa and the world at large in relation to the time at which this book is specifically being released? I know you touched on some of those topics, but if you can just rehash that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. We are living in perilous times. People are leaving us daily. The levels of poverty, are rising, especially amongst the majority. It has been, recorded accurately so that inequalities in South Africa, are increasing at a very, scary pace. The levels of corruption in our country are something that one cannot be proud of. The absence, of visionary leadership is something that is crying out loud, to be noticed. The vision, common uniting vision that we should have seems to be, eluding us, which is a big problem. And I think this book, as I've read, the article by Professor Black in this book, I think it promises to make a serious contribution to bring about, a better understanding of what is confronting us and perhaps how we could tackle it. It is important to understand that as South Africans, when we try to resolve our problems, and that is what also I like, in his book, that we don't solve our problems from a racial perspective. I see Professor Platy invited, academics from across, the broad spectrum of our society, which is something that is laudable. It is really, his approach is really an antithesis of what we see today when racism seems to be on the rise in our country, and is so unfortunate. He is an activist. This is what one can say about this book. He's an activist. He is, like he has always been doing, he just does not approach the writing of a book, to flaunt, his intellectual prowess. But he did that, tried to get the best, out of people who are the best, in their areas of expertise, to confront the problems, the challenges that we're having in our country. I believe that this book, promises to make a very serious contribution on how we can resolve the problems facing our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ike, for that contribution. We're now going to move on to the next question, which is going to be addressed to Neil Cole. The question asks, what are the types of capabilities that institutions require that can contribute to sustainability? And in your answer, I'd really like you to touch on what is meant by sustainability, specifically in the context of making institutions work, the publication.
Thank you, Danielle. And maybe as a preamble to answering the questions, let me just say that, it's obviously not just about capabilities, right? And I think that is what the book brings out very strongly. There's this nexus of many factors that combined to strengthen institutions. There's, alongside capabilities, there's obviously the political leadership, the senior management within an institution. There's the accountability framework and the extent to which people are held accountable for performance, as well as when things do go wrong. And I suppose coming to that point on sustainability, the types of actions that we take, the decisions that we reach, has to have in mind whether something is going to be sustainable. Whether it is a decision that we take, whether we're going to be increasing our borrowing as a government, wage increases that we may decide on. All of that has a carry through and has an impact on whether something is going to be sustainable going forward. But let me point to or highlight 4 capabilities that I believe are important, and this would apply to many types of institutions. It certainly applies to the institution that Daniel and I worked for some time, and that is the National Treasury. And there's a really excellent chapter in the book by Stephen Friedman, where he speaks about the department as an institution using the National Treasury as an example. The first capability is this capability, analytical capability. And this is an ability of it's really an organization's ability to digest and process information and turn that into advice and political decisions that are taken. And this is particularly true for the National Treasury. I mean, we were receiving information from line ministries, from at a national level, at a provincial level, at a local government level. We were getting in data from the market. We were getting in data from international and regional organizations. And that analytical ability that we were able to put in place in the National Treasury allowed us to do exactly that, right? To digest and process that information and to turn it into the advice that we were then able to give to the minister and also to cabinet, and also the sort of the knowledge that we then had to persuade some of our colleagues in other ministries of particular positions that we were taking. The second is the regulatory capability. And this is really about controlling the production of particular services that are delivered by others. I mean, examples of this will be the FFC, for instance, or the South African Reserve Bank, right? Where it oversees the activities of financial institutions, banks, etc. Right? But you need to obviously be bringing in that capability where people know exactly what the regulations are, what the law is, and able to ensure that in the way that different institutions go about their production, that they do that in step with the law, the prescripts. The third is a really, really interesting one, and I think very important, and one that we sometimes overlook, and that is the coordinative ability, right? And this is about really managing the activities of other parts of government to produce certain results and outcomes, including the convening powers and skills of a national minister, for instance, or a department. So if you think about our constitution that has concurrent functions in place, I mean, it's national cannot just, if we are implementing education or health, national cannot just say, you will do the following in the following way. In order to get things done in health and in education, land restitution and land reform, you do need to be able to convene your leaders within provinces, your heads of departments in provinces, in order to get people onto the same page, irrespective of the political party that they may come from, to get them on the same page and to coordinate in order for the country to at least look like it is following a coherent set of policy priorities. And then the fourth one and the last one that I want to share is I suppose the most important one, and that is the delivery capability, right? So the production of key deliverables on time, such as the budget. I mean, we said that we're going to table the budget the last Wednesday in Feb, and we would do so at the beginning of the budget process. And other than an election year, we were able to stick to that deadline. So just that ability to deliver on the budget is an important capability. But this applies to, saying that you are going to have somebody's ID ready 2 weeks after application is a delivery capability. Being able to ensure that you are not going to go into a hospital and in hospital you're going to be infected with all kinds of other viruses and bacteria is a delivery capability. Same with ensuring that learning material to no-fee schools arrive on time, or at least within the week that the school opens, is a delivery capability. So thinking about capabilities, it would be those three: analytical, regulatory, coordinative, and then also that delivery capability. But that doesn't stand on its own. All those other things matter as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Neil, for that, that very detailed answer. I'm now going to head into the next question that is addressed to Chen. It asks, the book considers various issues surrounding the ramifications of corruption on leadership and in trust in South Africa over the last 10 years specifically. Why do you consider this topic particularly relevant at this time, or why do you think the book places so much importance on considering leadership throughout all the chapters?
Thanks for the question. So with regards to a role of leadership, I resonate especially with Prof. Blackie's observation in the opening chapter that we, the people, mold and shape by choice through political will at the legislatures to establish institutions. In that one simple sentence, actually, you just described the entire public sector and the purpose and the constitutional intent. In other words, right. And in other words, we made these institutions in our own image, in a way, right? And agree to the terms and conditions developed by these institutions as policies. So in economics, I think we often say principal-agent problem, trying to figure out who is the principal and who is the agent. I think in this book, quite importantly, in trying to really understand corruption and the origin, how does it come about? How does corruption happen, right? Prof. Blackie is teaching us that it should actually, there's a space for another question, which is a principal institution problem. And the role of leadership by principals, not the principal, but the principal agent, the principal, is the glue that binds the institution. The leadership by that principle is the glue that binds the institution, together with through building trust. In chapter 1, he also said that leadership as a critical vehicle in facilitating, building, and maintaining trust within public institutions. Then later on in chapter 2, there's the discussion around leadership should not be accepted blindly, just like trust. I take it that leadership is also to be earned, to work, not given. Leadership as an institution, and earlier as also we carve these institutions in people's image, essentially through the democratic process. That leadership as a form of self, form of people, and leaders as builders of that trust. So I think if you'll let me just reminisce just a little bit now about the principal type of leadership and the difficult discussions that we had at the FFC with Prof. Blackie as a chairperson and how he built trust. See, we understood very well that whether it be public or private, any institution where more than one individual come together with opinions and preferences, or as we economists like to call it, utility functions, a leader needs to be that intersection connecting all those vectors, the glue, whilst maintaining still, hopefully, some form of core values like ethics, moral values. The principles. And Prof's principles, I can still remember, is, as I said, public value and the interest of the people and the citizen of South Africa, but also important teachings that I picked up from him, like principle of equivalence. I do not want to forget that. And his honesty, which we will call it out when there is even something as like, he described the tail wags the dog. That he cautions us about. So his frankness and his candidness demonstrated this principle type of leadership, which I keep going back to, and convinced me to trust him and follow him in his footstep and direction. So that's, in that sense, the leadership and trust, that's how he demonstrated it. And at the FFC. Now, if the last bit's about why is it so relevant, why is it so important? Look, I think there is, in South Africa, there's definitely we are in a time of this public trust deficit. You know, we have budget deficit, we have current account deficits, twin deficits, but I think there is a big gap in this public trust. People of South Africa today find it very hard to believe in public institutions, companies, even funds, right? And I don't think anyone should blame them. I mean, all philosophical and political jargons aside, I think it has something to do with the fact that almost every public institution today seems to have its own commission of inquiry. The Public Investments Corporation that had the Impati Commission, the key fiscal revenue collection agency of SARS had the Nugents. As if this was not enough, there's a commission for the statewide inquiry, the Zondo Commission, that still is playing out on the television and everywhere, which the chapter and the book on leadership, institution, governance makes many mentions of, and it's definitely worth a read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen, for that answer that you gave us. Very, very detailed. Thank you for that. The next question is addressed to Stephen. It says the book touches on the importance of independent oversight institutions, and Chen also did touch on that in his answer, to ensure good governance. Please could you elaborate on this and its relevance to our current times, and also the way that the book actually addresses it?
Sure. So my profession, what I do every day is I'm an evaluator. I try to look at the performance of institutions and try to come to some sort of assessment of the merit and worth that they bring to society, or achieving their objectives or societal objectives. So when I read the book, I was trying to look at the book from that perspective. What is it can I take away from this book to help rethink my own practice in this sort of independent oversight role that I occupy? And I think that one of the hardest things to do in that independent oversight role is to speak truth to power in a way that's influential and can be heard. Sometimes you want to speak truth to power in a way that's projecting your own grievance in a way, and that's not necessarily very influential. Sometimes you may want to speak truth to power in a way that in your own language or sort of philosophical outlook, and that's not going to be able to be heard. So I think I started to take away from this book, or started to reflect upon, is the kind of themes again that it sort of brought out in how I can think of my role as an evaluator in my own independent oversight, and what that could mean for other independent oversight institutions. So again, we touched on it a few times, but that honesty of institutions, and I think that comes with being able to be honest about the cultural norms that they embody, the way that people interact in these institutions, whether they interact with respect, whether they interact with kindness, or whether there's some sort of toxicity within that institution. And I think that's something that independent oversight institutions, in that role of guarding the guardians, watching the watchmen, should be able to play. It's to be helpful in a way to draw out where the cultural norms and functions are helpful and where they're actually debilitating and preventing things from working. I think there's also that oversight role of keeping an eye on the honest and efficient financial management role. Now, I'm not an auditor, so I don't necessarily go into the books, but I do have a sort of role in asking, was this money spent in an effective way? And I think what the book starts to direct us to is, there's a classic formulation we use in evaluation. Are you doing things right, and are you doing the right things? So implementing in the right way, are you meeting the right sort of objectives in doing that? But I think what the book takes us back to, and Daniel's opening chapter, is, are we working to the right values? What's the overall mandate and values framework that we need to come back to in thinking about what the honesty of institutions looks like. I think the second thing that I started to take away and think about more so, and it's really been a theme since I've worked with Daniel, is how do we get citizens' voice appropriately into that space? I think the privilege of oversight institutions, and they sort of talk about that in the budgeting sense within the book, is to be able to talk to a plurality or try to hear the voice of a plurality of citizens and try to represent those or bring those about, bring them in a solid evidential form to say, this is how people are experiencing a policy. This is what it looks like on the end side. Having worked in institutions of a variety of forms in government and international NGOs, multinational organizations, keeping your eye, understanding how what people's felt needs are and how they actually feel the power of the institution escapes you when you're inside of those. And having that independent oversight role ought to be able to orientate you back to those or provide you with evidence to check yourself to say, are we actually doing something that we meant to do? Are we responding to the people in the way that was supposed to respond to, not just responding to people, those who have the better access, who have captured a certain amount of power, or those voices that are loudest in our ear. And I think what the book also sort of requires as an independent oversight, and myself in conducting that evaluation exercises, is again that, this is a quote or a paraphrase from the book, that leaders are individuals who act ethically and ensure the individual ethics of the people around them and the institutions that they lead and the institutions that they interact with. And that I thought was like a tremendous scope. I was like, when I first read that, I was, wow, I could look after my ethics. Maybe I can look after those of people around me. But keeping an eye on the ethics of those institutions I interact with and taking some responsibility on that, that sort of scared me at first. But I think it's reading that, it reminded me of that, that agency again that we have, that ability to influence others, to interact with others, to try and cause something better about them. And for me, I think that's what I saw Daniel trying to do when I worked with him at PNDM, Public and Development Management, which became Wits School of Governance at the time. When I spoke to him about his roles in the Treasury, SASA, in the Free State, and indeed I did some work with him in the Free State, is trying to get that leadership of that in that interaction, and not just saying I'm responsible for my own house. It's saying, how can I be responsible for myself and also get that interaction with others to do better? And I think that's something I need to reflect upon in my own practice and what I do as an evaluator is influence the organization I work with, but remember that it also influences or can touch those around us. And that by standing up morally and ethically and keeping an eye on citizens around us and responding to those, that's the best practice I think we could hope for from our independent oversight institutions, which we don't always see, unfortunately, but the opportunities there. And I think my final statement was, I think coming out of these 3 books is that sort of energy Daniel had for the future. He talked about the future inheritance. And that comes in this book. It's not everything's cock at the moment, but we have this opportunity to make things better. And so that eye on the future, on that inheritance, on that stewardship, I think that's the role of those oversight institutions that I think comes out within this book.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, for that answer. I greatly appreciate it. I know the panelists wanted to touch back on sort of a lot of the things that are happening in South Africa, particularly in the Office of the Public Protector as an example of an institution in South Africa. And we want to briefly touch on that before we do answer some of the questions that have been posted. Again, a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please post your name, what sort of organization you represent, and if there is someone in particular you want to address the question to, you can also post the question into the chat, and then we will answer that question for you. All right, I'm going to hand over to Neil now.
Thanks, Daniel, for giving me another opportunity and to also, I suppose, lead on this issue of the public protector. I'm going to make a few points and also just say that I think the study into the Public Protector's Office and what went right and what went so horribly wrong is certainly going to be a topic for lots of research, right? Because in many ways it presents no better example of a concept that Daniel shares in his chapter, right? This concept of institutional differentiation, meaning that institutions are not simply equated with organization, formal structures and frameworks, but are compendiums that reflect institutional differentiation of networks, hierarchies, and bureaucracies. So I hope that when those studies are undertaken, that they answer the question, I mean, why was the previous public protector able to bring down an allegedly corrupt and predatory president, right? And why is it that the current PP seems to be acting in a way that undermines the office and is now subject to, as Chen refers to, one of the many inquiries, right? This is a parliamentary inquiry where there was just a vote on going ahead with the inquiry. So when we do that study, I mean, we're going to have to look at, I think, very carefully at this concept that is spoke of in the chapter, the one of institutional differentiation. I mean, it cannot just be a case of replacing the top dog and the institution then falls to pieces, right? There has to be more to our institutions that ensure that word that comes up again, and that is sustainability. Yes, it is about leadership, but it certainly has to be a lot more than that. Let me turn to the Treasury example again, because we did have a change of leadership in the Treasury. I mean, after Trevor Manuel, there was Pravin Gordhan. Pravin was replaced with Shlanshla Nene. Shlanshla Nene was briefly replaced by Des van Rooyen, and then Des van Rooyen was once again replaced by Pravin Gordhan, right? So there was, like, at a leadership level, upheaval. But what we did see is that the budget process, to a large degree, remained in place and untouched. The Public Finance Management Act remained despite the pushback, and very, very strong pushback. And the Treasury remained a significant obstacle to the patronage that was taking place at the time, right? So despite the change of, if my count is correct, 4 finance ministers over that time. And I suppose I'd want to end by saying that, you know, part of the study can then look at the Treasury survived Zuma, but unfortunately the PP, the Public Protector's Office, did not fare so well when Thuli left. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Oh,
Before we take the questions that have been posted, some of the questions, and I know we are sort of heading towards the end of this online book launch, I want to ask if any of the panelists would like to add on to that last question. And then thereafter, I'm going to pick out one of the questions that have been posted, and then we can close up this discussion. Okay, great, fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists for such a great discussion. We do have one question here from, well, we have 2 questions from Obed Notsi, who refers to themselves as a social activist. They ask, is the book reflective on how institutions may be made tangible tools of actual or real change that can be impactful in the lives of ordinary people in South Africa? Any volunteers on taking that question? I will say that the book does actually touch on that. The book sort of covers both the problem and the solution in all the institutions that it does try to cover. And that's what makes it almost like a handbook of sorts. It's a toolbox. If you want to get a snapshot into the issues that the National Treasury currently faces and how to solve those problems, there's a chapter on that. If you want to know about trust and leadership and about both trust as perceived, trustworthiness in institution and actual trustworthiness, and how both are equally important in terms of how an institution is seen as legitimate, the book also touches on that. So it's very, very broad in terms of those kinds of things. If any of our panelists wants to also contribute to that question, I'll open the floor.
I mean, I'm almost thinking that I could be the best person to come in on and to make some comments on that question. I mean, to also then just complement some of the responses from yourself, Daniel. Maybe if I can, maybe just sort of a short response. I mean, if I was to get the gist of why, Daniel pulled together this book, and just from the many hours of conversations that I had with him at the Treasury, or one of those many famous long telephonic conversations, I mean, then I think it is about that, if all of this doesn't change the lives of people, then it really doesn't matter all that much. And I mean, I once spoke to a what they called him, principal secretary of the Ugandan Ministry of Finance, so almost like the equivalent of a DG. And, he said to me, all these reforms that we being asked to undertake, whether it is the World Bank or IMF that wants us to undertake these reforms, or it's a reform that we believe we should undertake, if these reforms don't, change the life of a villager, then the reform doesn't matter. I mean, he put it as bluntly as that. And I think it is about, changing people's lives and how all of this, and there was certainly a point in Daniel's life where he decided that, he was going to pursue an academic achievement. And as Dr. Oscar van Heerden says, when you've done the PhD, you've reached the pinnacle. And I think for Daniel, reaching that pinnacle was to answer questions on how does all of this change people's lives. And I think that is important as a contribution that this book makes. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you so much. I see that our attendees have posted quite a few questions still. I do think if you go to danielplaatjes.com, and once the website launches on the Sunday, you can post some of your questions there. And, reading the book might answer a lot of the questions that you do have too. So I encourage you to give it a read. That is all that we have time for today, unfortunately. I mean, it would be great to chat for hours, but just in terms of being in an online setting, it would be a bit much to ask for everyone to be here for another 8 hours or so. But I want to thank our panelists from basically the bottom of my heart, but also just for your contributions, your passion. And I hope that you all continue to do the work that you do, and that today's discussion was also fulfilling for you in terms of getting your mind thinking about a lot of the issues that are covered in this book. And I encourage everyone to give it a read too. It's understandable. I can read it. It's not up there on the grade level. I think it's a very accessible book for anyone who really wants to touch in or sort of find out more about these issues and read about the contributors. There's amazing contributors. All their names are listed on their HSRC website, where you can find the book. The book will also be available at exclusivebooks.com. And again, just a reminder, if you go to danielplaatjes.com, you can get access to all of this information. A big thank you to everyone at the HSRC, and another big thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you so much to everyone who attended for your interest. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Good evening.